Underlings, lackeys, subordinates, tools, thugs, goons, and minions. These are all words describing the followers of the usual driving force within your story and setting. The antagonists that are trying to change the world to their likings and whims. Oftentimes, their followers get overlooked. Their screen time gets justified by being mowed down by the protagonist. They are there to be an obstacle without actually being one. They lack any personality beyond maybe some clothing or uniform or armor. They sometimes might turn into elite goons later on in the story, which at that point are just as easily mowed down and only got the power up to show how much the protagonist became stronger despite always having been pretty much overpowered. And beyond that, they might have no real impact on the story at all. You don't want these kinds of goons in your story. You want compelling minions for your well-written antagonist, followers and goons that are just as fun to watch as the villain themselves, perhaps. Then watch this video to learn the art of creating followers. Anyways, I've got 3 questions for you to orientate yourself on, to make your lackeys, goons and subordinates into something interesting and compelling. At least more interesting than the standard idiots you see in a lot of media. To get the important things off the table right from the get-go. Ideology and motivation. The ideology, the reason your antagonist and his minions, or the evil organization, or anyone else of importance in your world for that matter, fights. And maybe even take lives over it. Maybe they might even let their own lives over it. Even when your organization or antagonist hires nothing more but mercenaries to do their dirty work, the ideology or their motivation to fight influences the way the goons act. The mercenaries aren't in it for the ideology of the villain, at least usually. A mercenary's prime motivation is money, or any other material compensation. Depending on who we are talking about, they very well might be looting and pillaging the lands on their own accord, barely even controlled by the antagonist or villain, who might get a lot of his bad reputation because of the mercenary he employs. There might be a more idealistic motivation, of course. People who believe in what they fight for, in the ideologies the antagonist represents. This doesn't necessarily need to be a good motivation, of course. They might be just as evil as their master. Their actions just as much influenced by the ideology as their masters. They might follow certain moral codes or dogmas. They might follow certain tactics and strategies dictated by their ideology. Their decision making is heavily influenced by their motivations, so show it. You don't have to write entire backstories for each and one of those goons. It's enough to show their quirks in encounters. Make them act brutal in certain situations, while acting nice and honorable in others. Make their strategy straightforward. A simple battle line facing eye to eye with their enemy because it's just their honorable way to fight. Or a brutal ambush from the shadows. Quick and dirty, but effective. Beyond tactics and strategy, their behavior when interacting with the protagonists, and anyone else for that matter, heavily depends on their ideology as well. They might even be not that bad of a people overall. I use Star Wars and Andor to show you a near-perfect example of a goon that was influenced by his ideologies, or rather, the ideologies of the state. Small Andor spoilers ahead. Skip to the time on the screen if you don't want to see those spoilers. In Andor, you get to see how Imperial doctrine influenced the people's minds and thus the goons' very actions. Syril Karn isn't technically an Imperial goon and is more of an antagonist of the series, but he practically fulfills every niche of a goon. Karn tried to solve a murder committed by Andor. His direct boss refused to solve on his own because it would only gather the ire of the state. During the series, his eagerness to follow both Imperial doctrine and law got him into trouble with the very state state he tried to serve, and he still thought he had to continue his duty to the state, as he was digging into something deeper than anyone originally assumed.
I was a good deputy inspector.
I was very good. I solved a double murder and found the killer in 2 days. It was overly ambitious, yes, but time was slipping away and the opportunity was real. Service to the Empire. You just said it. Can one ever be too aggressive in preserving order?
In the end, Syril Karn is just a goon with a bit more screen time. The goon's ideology, her motivation and behavior heavily influence the second factor that might be important, their skill levels. Goons exist not to mow them down like you mow the grass in your lawn, but to put up a challenge in front of your protagonists before the climax. They are the representatives of your villain that tell your audience almost as much about the villain as the villain themselves. Their actions reflect on the villain, thus their danger reflects on the villain. If your goons are mowed down and pose no obstacle, if they don't use any tactics or strategy or any other way for them to make their own lives easier, if they never flee or try to surrender to keep their skin, if no surrender or flight isn't some insane part of their ideology of course. If that all applies, they are inhumane and lack personality. All interest in them is lost. And this greatly decreases my interest in the piece of media and especially the villain. That's why making your goons into a threat, into actual challenges for your protagonists to overcome, is an important step for your story and world. Make your goons adapt themselves to the strategies and tactics of your protagonists, or the main organization your protagonists are a part of. It's almost a guilty pleasure of mine, but a certain progression of difficulty and goon types are a very good sign of the progression of your heroes, while simultaneously keeping up the sense of danger for your goons. This works the best and is also the most realistic when your goons are eventually all beaten down. This is even better when you show the goons to have a certain downfall at the end of the story, when their most experienced fighters were already sent out and died or were captured, and now they only have new inexperienced trainees and recruits with perhaps strong equipment they can barely handle or just rugged leftovers. I think the original season of Gundam makes one of the best jobs with this, even more than 40 years after it aired. During the 1-year war, Zeon already lost many of its most experienced fighters at the beginning of the war, while the story itself only starts right at the point the Earth Federation gains more ground. Amuro, the protagonist and the actual Gundam pilot, wins at first only because he has the technological upper hand, but he still struggles, and you can see him overcome the challenges the writers put in front of him by becoming a better pilot over time. Later during the series, Zeon's mobile suits and their pilots become more experienced with dealing with the Gundam, and the named goons become a more serious threat actually. They put Amuro and the crew of the White Base into danger, and at times they don't even need mobile suits to achieve that. Over the span of the show, Zeon's goons are pretty much the reason that made the White Base into a serious fighting force over time, after being a ragtag crew of not even officially enlisted colonials, many of whom were underage. And on top of that, these goons the White Base was fighting had personalities and motivations, explained by their implied backstories. They basically evolved along with the mobile suits they were piloting, and at the latest stage of the war, there was this line by one of the admirals of Zeon, which was like the cherry on top.
But the Gelgoogs and Doms aren't doing very well. What's the problem, Twanning?
Ma'am, it appears that many mobile suits have student recruits at the controls.
Students?
Yes, but I assure you they're fully trained.
I believe you, but it's the outcome I'm concerned about. They're losing badly.
I'm terribly sorry, ma'am, but you won't find pilots more patriotic.
If only the late Admiral had come to appreciate new types earlier.
Besides goons, whose difficulty and personalities evolve with the protagonists as much as the villain does, the goons in Gundams have another thing that makes interesting goons and minions, and that is their aesthetic. To be fair, Zeon's mobile suits and especially their mobile armors are designs of their time, but the Zaku's are iconic, as much as the Stormtroopers in Star Wars are a good and fun set of goons with a striking and iconic aesthetic, make them just as interesting as their danger. A good uniform, certain quirks, songs and battle cries, a certain armor and a set of weapons that make you remember them. There are many evil empires and organizations in this world you can use to influence the designs of your goons. So many aesthetic choices to choose and pick from, to adapt to your own. You can make your design stand out. So please avoid taking the Nazi designs. I think for fantasy, one of the classic aesthetics for villains is of course the evil overlord aesthetic, heavily influenced by the Lord of the Rings films, including their orc and goblin goons of course. Sauron's orcs and goblins are a grey mass of brutal, uncivilized creatures, dark and kinda edgy to their core. The Lord's aesthetic represented by his goons. But to be fair, evil overlords like Sauron and their goons are a bit boring. Instead, think about both the ideology and culture of your villains and how their goons should represent that ideology and culture by the way they dress and clothe themselves in armor. Uniforms are very militaristic and orderly. Armor is a bit more warrior-like and medieval. Their armor can be colorful, while their actions speak for the villain's evil quite a bit more, making a fabulous contrast. That's it for today's video, world builders. I hope you liked it. Tell me about your antagonists, goons, in your setting in the comments. And subscribe. See ya.